I didn't expect to see her here. Not in this quiet corner of the cafe, where the sunlight slanted through the blinds just enough to make the dust motes dance like tiny golden stars. Yet there she was, her presence pulling at something in me that I didn't know could be stirred so easily. She looked up from her cup of tea the moment I stepped in. Her eyes, a quiet shade of hazel flecked with gold, widened for just a heartbeat before her lips curved into that subtle, knowing smile. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice calm, almost too measured, like she was testing me. But I came for her. I approached slowly, each step deliberate, trying to catch every small movement. How her hand brushed against the ceramic cup, the way her fingers lingered on the edge, the gentle tilt of her head that made her neck catch the light in a way that made my chest tighten. She was mid-40s, graceful in a way that seemed effortless, but there was a quiet vulnerability behind the confidence she carried, a softness that drew me closer without words. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice low, as if saying too much might shatter the fragile tension threading between us. She looked at me for longer than she should have, a pause so deliberate that it felt like the air itself had thickened. "You came early," she whispered, though her eyes said more. They traced my form with something between curiosity and caution, and I noticed the faint tremble in her hands as she adjusted her scarf. I wanted to reach across the table, let my fingers brush hers, see if the connection sparked in the way it always did. I sat down, careful not to invade her space, but close enough that her scent, warm, faintly floral, the trace of her perfume, hit me like a gentle ache. The sunlight caught her hair, a mixture of chestnut and silver strands, and for a moment I thought I might be suspended in it, caught between wanting to speak and wanting to remain silent, letting the quiet speak for me. Her gaze didn't leave mine. I felt it slide over me slowly, assessing, curious, and I caught a flicker of something else there. Recognition? Longing? Maybe both. My fingers brushed the edge of my cup, but I noticed hers moving almost imperceptibly closer to mine, not touching, just hovering, teasing. I wanted that warmth, that nearness. Wanted the simple act of contact to mean more than it should. The cafe around us blurred into soft background noise, the clink of spoons, the muted laughter of people who didn't know the gravity of a single look, a single pause, sitting heavy between two hearts. Every micro-movement mattered. How she tilted her head, how her shoulders relaxed then stiffened, how her lips pressed together just slightly when she chose her words. "I didn't expect to see you," she repeated, this time softer, closer to a question. Her eyes held mine, steady and unflinching, yet full of everything she wasn't saying. And I leaned forward slightly, careful, but not enough to stop the heat that made my chest feel tight. "But I came for you," I replied, and I didn't need to say more. The words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of her perfume, heavier than the quiet hum of the cafe. She blinked, just once, and her lips parted ever so slightly. A shiver of acknowledgement passed between us, silent, undeniable. And then, the door creaked open behind her. Someone else entering. A sound that shattered the delicate bubble around us. Her head turned, eyes flicking to the interruption, and in that instant, the electricity between us held on by a thread, fragile and impossible to ignore. She turned back to me, her smile smaller now, more private, almost wary. "It's been a while," she murmured, as if testing the waters, careful with her words. I nodded, watching her hands fold over her cup, noticing the faint tremor of a ring she hadn't worn in years. I had known her long enough to remember that ring, how it had glinted on her finger during a summer long before I existed in her world. A life lived, a story untold, and yet here we were, caught in the tension of something neither of us dared to name aloud. We were mismatched. Yes, she carried the weight of decades, of experience, of subtle heartbreaks that shaped the way she moved through the world. And I was too young in comparison, still learning the delicate art of restraint, of holding desire without speaking it too loud. Yet I could not stop noticing her, the tilt of her chin, the way her hair fell just right over one shoulder, the warmth of her presence that seemed to push the air between us into something heavier, something charged. "I didn't expect to see anyone I knew here," she said finally, her voice soft, a fraction of hesitation betraying her composure. I caught the glance she cast toward the doorway, as though imagining eyes of judgment, the whispers of people who might frown at our closeness. The thought of age, of perception, of the quiet rules that tethered her life, hung between us like an invisible barrier. I reached out almost unconsciously, my fingers brushing the back of her hand. She flinched ever so slightly, then let herself stay, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between us. That one small contact, brief, fleeting, spoke of everything we hadn't said: curiosity, longing, risk. "You always notice things," she said quietly, eyes scanning me with that same mixture of exasperation and something softer, something almost tender. I swallowed. I did notice. I noticed the way her shoulders carried a history she didn't speak of, the slight hesitation before she laughed at her own jokes, the gentle sighs she released when she thought no one was watching. I noticed everything. She leaned just a fraction closer, and I felt the warmth of her breath against my ear as she asked, "Do you still wonder about the things we left behind?" Her words were indirect, teasing, but they landed heavy in my chest. I wanted to answer honestly, but restraint won this round. Instead, I let my hand linger near hers again, almost daring her to notice. She did, just a tilt of her head, a tiny exhale, but pulled back slightly, keeping the boundary intact. The push and pull between us, so small, so quiet, carried more intensity than any confession could. The cafe noise faded around us. The clink of spoons, the distant chatter, even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to exist in a different plane. Only we remained, two bodies aware of space, two hearts testing proximity. And then, almost by accident, our hands touched again, fingers brushing, lingering longer this time. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. And in that moment, without words, without promises, the air between us hummed with unspoken electricity, binding us closer in a secret understanding that would not be broken easily. The cafe door jingled again, and she flinched, just slightly, a shadow passing across her face. I followed her gaze. A familiar colleague of hers passed by, glancing toward our table with a faint smile before moving on. She exhaled softly, a whisper of relief I could hear only because I was leaning closer than I should have. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I let my hand rest lightly on the edge of the table, fingers almost brushing hers. She noticed, of course. How could she not? And her own hand hovered, trembling slightly before retreating. Not entirely, though. She left it there, just within reach, a quiet invitation without admitting it. The space between us shrank without conscious thought. Her shoulder brushed mine. The warmth of her body settled like a weight I both feared and craved. I could feel her breath, the slight catch as she laughed softly at some memory she didn't share, and the scent of her, subtle, floral, with a hint of something uniquely hers, filled my senses so completely that I had to remind myself to breathe. A message pinged on my phone. Reflexively, I glanced down and felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Something trivial, mundane, but in that charged atmosphere, even the smallest interruption felt like a potential disaster. I looked back up. Her eyes were locked on mine again, hazel flecks catching the light, unspoken words waiting behind them. We shouldn't," she murmured, almost too quiet to hear, though I felt the tension in her jaw, the slight quiver of her lips. It wasn't a warning exactly. It was a plea, a challenge, a confession disguised as caution. My chest tightened. I wanted to lean forward, close the space between us, feel the brush of her lips against mine. I wanted to close my eyes and surrender to the pull that had been building since the moment I saw her in this cafe. But reason, the rules, the quiet echo of social expectation, everything screamed to stop, to wait. Still, the temptation lingered, thick and undeniable. Our knees brushed under the table. Our hands hovered inches apart. Then in a flicker of courage, or madness, our fingers grazed, a spark that traveled up my arm and left my heart racing. She caught her breath and looked down, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. I wanted to say her name. I wanted to tell her exactly what I felt, what I had been feeling since the first time we met in a different life, in different circumstances. But silence seemed safer, heavier, more intimate than words. And yet, in the space between heartbeats, in that trembling pause, we both edged closer, drawn together by a gravity neither of us could resist. Her hand rested finally, almost casually, on my wrist, not a full embrace, not a confession, but close enough to make the world shrink to the size of this table, this moment. We stayed like that, inches apart, tension stretching and bending around us, neither daring to break the spell, neither able to pull back entirely. The forbidden, the thrilling, the quietly electric pull between us wrapped tighter with every breath, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt her entirely. Close, present, impossibly near. The cafe had emptied almost entirely, leaving us in a bubble of quiet, punctuated only by the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I watched her stir her coffee slowly, eyes lowered, fingers lingering on the spoon as if she needed the motion to anchor herself. I wanted to reach across the table and brush the hair from her face, not as a gesture of civility, but to feel the warmth of her skin, the curve of her cheek, the soft exhale she couldn't hide when my fingers might touch her. My hand itched to move, to close the space that had been shrinking between us all afternoon, to do something irrevocable. She looked up suddenly, catching my gaze, and I felt a jolt as if electricity had passed through my chest. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, and yet there was a softness there, a flicker of invitation I hadn't seen before. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" she whispered, voice low, vulnerable, teasing. "Like what?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my throat was tight, my heart hammering. "Like you want something you're not supposed to want." Her words hovered, fragile and dangerous. I swallowed hard. She was right. Every part of me wanted her, wanted the nearness, the risk, the impossible gravity of her presence. And every part of me knew the line we were hovering over was sharp and clear. Step too far, and there was no return. I leaned just slightly forward, careful not to crush the invisible barrier between us, but close enough to feel her breath, warm and scented with coffee and faint vanilla. She didn't move back. She didn't pull her hand away from the cup. And then, almost instinctively, I let my fingers brush against hers. A spark shot through my chest, and I held it there, suspended in the moment. Her lips parted, and I thought she might speak, or maybe she would lean closer, close enough to erase the distance with a single, decisive movement. My mind raced, torn between hesitation and the desperate need to close the space between us. "You're dangerous," she murmured, almost a warning, almost a confession. I caught her hand, not fully, just the edge of her palm, and she shivered. A small, involuntary sound escaped her, soft, fragile, and it hit me harder than anything she could have said aloud. I wanted to tell her then. Tell her everything. How I had been watching from afar, how I had thought of her endlessly, how every stolen glance, every accidental touch, had left me breathless. But the words caught, lodged in my throat like a secret too fragile to release. Instead, I leaned forward just a fraction more, enough that our foreheads almost touched. The warmth of her presence pressed into me, magnetic and impossible to resist. I could feel her heartbeat, rapid and uncertain, just as frantic as mine. And then she spoke, a single, trembling word that hung in the space between us. "Don't." It was a warning. It was a plea. It was everything unsaid. I leaned closer anyway. The world contracted to the edge of a breath, the brush of a hand, the weight of anticipation. And somewhere just beyond that frail boundary, a kiss waited, impossible and inevitable all at once. The sudden vibration of her phone on the table made both of us jump, a flash of irritation followed by curiosity in her eyes. She glanced at it, fingers trembling slightly, then hesitated before unlocking the screen. My gaze drifted to hers and froze. A message preview glowed from someone I didn't know, but the words were unmistakable. "I saw you there with him." Her breath caught. She looked up at me, eyes wide, cheeks flushed, not from the heat of the cafe, but from something heavier. Fear, shame, uncertainty, all tangled in a moment that made the air between us feel both tighter and more electric. I wanted to reach across and reassure her, but every instinct screamed caution. Her fingers hovered over the screen, brushing against mine, and the smallest contact sent a jolt through me. She pulled back, almost imperceptibly, yet the warmth of her palm lingered like a shadow, teasing the memory of closeness we'd almost allowed ourselves. "Who sent this?" I asked carefully, keeping my voice low. She swallowed, eyes darting away, and I noticed the faint quiver in her jaw. It doesn't matter, she said, but the lie hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. I could tell she wanted to protect me, or herself, or both. We sat in silence, the tension growing, until I realized her leg was brushing mine under the table, an accidental contact that was no longer accidental. Her pulse pressed through the thin fabric of her skirt, and I felt my own heartbeat spike. Every micro-movement, her breath catching, the way her shoulder brushed mine as she shifted, spoke louder than any words could. "You're hiding something," I murmured, leaning just a fraction closer, daring her to respond. She froze, just a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, then let herself meet my gaze again, full and unguarded, if only for a heartbeat. Maybe I shouldn't have come," she admitted finally, her voice trembling, almost breaking. But I couldn't. I couldn't stay away. The words landed like a spark in dry grass. I leaned closer, careful not to cross the line, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. Her breath brushed my cheek, and I had to resist the impulse to close the last fraction of space between us. Her hand hovered near mine, fingers twitching as if they wanted to reach for me, but couldn't. "This changes everything," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Her lips parted, a small exhale escaping, and her hand brushed mine again, closer this time, almost touching, almost surrendering. The proximity made my chest ache. I could feel the pull, the dangerous gravity between us, stronger now because of the secret, the risk, the thrill of knowing someone might be watching. And then she straightened slightly, a quiet decision in the tilt of her chin, the set of her shoulders. She didn't pull away fully, but she didn't let herself lean in further either. The moment hung, poised on the edge of inevitability. I knew, then, that whatever we did next, whatever confession, whatever touch, would change everything. There would be no going back. Yet I could not stop myself from leaning closer, drawn to her in a way I had no right to resist. The cafe was nearly empty now, the golden light of late afternoon casting long, lazy shadows across the worn wooden floor. She sat across from me, but the distance between us felt meaningless, an illusion easily erased by the pull that had been building for weeks. My fingers itched to reach for her, but I held back just long enough to savor the moment, the quiet, the tension. "You don't have to," she whispered, her voice low, almost trembling. "You can walk away." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let my eyes travel over her, over the curve of her neck, the subtle movement of her shoulders as she shifted, the way her lips parted ever so slightly, as if inviting a confession I wasn't sure I was ready to make. And yet, the moment stretched taut between us, fragile and irresistible. "I don't want to," I said finally, my own voice barely above a breath. The words were simple, but the weight behind them made my chest ache. Her eyes softened, the careful barrier she had maintained cracking just enough to show me the depth beneath, the years of caution, the hesitation, the longing she had tried to hide from the world, and even from herself. I leaned in slightly, just enough that the warmth of her body brushed against mine. Her breath hit my cheek, soft, intoxicating, and I felt her pulse through the thin fabric of her sleeve. My fingers hovered near hers, trembling with restraint, until she shifted slightly, letting them touch. Not fully, but close enough to know that the line between restraint and surrender had blurred. "I can't promise it'll be easy," she murmured, voice catching. "But I don't want to pretend I don't feel it." The honesty in her words, the vulnerability, the careful surrender, it was enough to shatter any lingering doubt. I reached across the table, letting my hand rest over hers. Warm, steady, deliberate. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, closer now, almost brushing her forehead against mine, letting the space shrink to nothing. The air between us was thick, heavy with every glance, every brush of fingers, every whispered word we hadn't said until now. I could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the slight shiver that ran through her when our hands touched, the faint scent of her perfume curling around me like a promise. "I've wanted this," I confessed softly, my lips near her ear, for far longer than I should have. Her lips curved into a small, trembling smile, a mixture of relief and recognition. "Me too," she whispered back, and the sound was enough to make the world shrink to the size of our table, our hands, the slow, deliberate space we had finally allowed ourselves to inhabit. No more hesitation. No more barriers. The choice had been made, messy and raw, human in its imperfection. We stayed like that, inches apart, suspended in the gravity of the moment, until the clarity settled between us. We understood each other now, fully, irrevocably, in a way that could not be undone. The unspoken tension, the longing, the fear, all of it had led to this. A mutual surrender that was quiet, tentative, and yet certain. And for the first time, we didn't need words. The city had softened into evening, the sun dipping low, painting the streets in honeyed tones. We walked together from the cafe, side by side, the quiet hum of the world around us fading into the background. There was no rush, no need for words, just the simple weight of presence, the subtle brush of her hand against mine, the shared rhythm of our steps. At the park nearby, we found an empty bench beneath a sprawling oak. She settled first, and I slid in beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder against mine. It was the kind of nearness that didn't need justification, no social expectation, no outside judgment, just us and the quiet, suspended moment. I reached for her hand, threading my fingers with hers. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she tightened her grip, letting herself lean slightly against me. That small act, the brush of palms, the tilt of her head toward mine, spoke of trust, of acknowledgement, of the barriers we had carried for so long finally giving way. "You're really here," she murmured, voice soft, almost in disbelief, though there was a smile tugging at her lips. "Not just in this moment, but really here." "I've been here," I whispered, leaning closer, letting my forehead rest lightly against hers. "I just didn't know how to stay." Her laughter was a quiet, airy sound, not full of humor but of relief, a letting go of tension we had both carried. She tilted her head, and I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, careful, tender, reverent in a way that made my chest ache. We stayed like that for a long moment, forehead to forehead, hands intertwined, breaths mingling in the cooling evening air. The hesitations of the past, the doubts, the age gap, the fear of perception, all of it seemed distant, almost irrelevant now. What mattered was this, the undeniable gravity pulling us together, the slow, human unfolding of something we had both wanted but had been too cautious to claim. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, a whisper, her hand squeezing mine. "But I want it with you. I want it too," I said, finally, no hesitations left. Every bit. And in that simple acknowledgement, all the tension dissolved. She leaned fully against me, our shoulders touching, fingers still entwined, and I rested my cheek lightly against hers. We didn't need more, no grand gestures, no declarations, just the quiet, human connection of two people finally allowing themselves to exist fully together. The evening settled around us like a soft blanket. Cars hummed in the distance, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, and yet all I noticed was her, the warmth of her body against mine, the subtle rhythm of her breathing, the small, perfect intimacy of simply being. She smiled, leaning her head just a little more against me, and I kissed the top of her hair, careful, reverent, final in a way that felt like both a promise and a beginning. And for the first time, we both knew. We were here, together, fully, completely. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?